Simon, and thank you for the invitation. It's really a great pleasure to be with you. And I still remember speaking at the launch event of the PROTECT.project, and that was the last event before lockdown. So it's in my memory. And since then, I've been involved as a member of the advisory board and followed the developments in a number of the work packages. So I think overall it's extremely good to see the production of so much useful research, and there's really a lot that's come out of the project that we'll be using in ECRE's work. And some of those elements I'll refer to in my comments, others I'm sure you'll see as we integrate them into our ongoing advocacy and legal work. What I'd like to do in this speech is to provide some comments on developments over those last 3 years and the time that the project has run. And looking at Europe's role in the global protection system, I wanted to take this framework of law versus politics and look at a few of the developments.
In obviously in any area of policy, an old battle, we might say. But I think there are particularly interesting developments if we look at the area of asylum and indeed migration policy, where we see how that relationship, those tensions, and sometimes those collaborations between law and politics works. I'm going to make 3 points and then happy to open for discussion and to hear your views. My first point is that asylum remains an area which is characterised by over-legislating and under-enforcement of the law. Since 2020, the start of the PROTECT.project, we have had yet more legislation at the EU level, more legislative proposals, and at national level also multiple legislative proposals in many jurisdictions. Now, as was mentioned by the Commission, 13 proposals pending, and yet at the same time enforcement of the law remains extremely weak. It's something that it's very hard to compare across areas of EU law, and that may be a research project in itself, but I think there are good reasons to argue that compliance and enforcement is much weaker in EU asylum law than in other areas of EU law. And some of the developments that we've seen in terms of how EU law in this particular area is developing and how it is regarded, I think would be unthinkable in other areas of EU law. And part of that also comes from the self-defined roles of the different institutions. Now, in terms of the legislative proposals that have been put forward, I'm not going to go into too much detail on the content. ECRE's analysis, I think, is well known and happy to elaborate in the discussion if that's of interest. Let us just look at the most likely outcome now, with this whole raft of legislative proposals still pending. We would argue that what is most likely is a partial reform, with some of the proposals accepted and others not. Or indeed some elements of some of the proposals extracted and put together in new forms. And in particular, and I think this is what I would take from what the Commission was presenting now, on the Council side, the Member State side, what we're seeing is the selection of elements from the RAM Regulation on Asylum Migration Management proposal, the Post-Dublin proposal, and the Asylum Procedures Regulation. So elements, some of the proposals may pass, others will not. And the reason for this prediction is the time pressure. There is basically 1 year for proposals to be accepted. In 1 year's time, or just over 1 year's time, the European Parliament elections will take place. There'll be a new Parliament coming in. At the same time, the mandate of the Commission ends and new commissioners will be coming in. And while those significant changes are taking place in those two institutions, there is a particularly concerning run of EU presidencies on the member state side. So starting from July of next year, the presidencies run Hungary, Poland and Denmark. So it can be envisaged that during that time, making progress on EU asylum law is not going to be a priority. And indeed, we can also imagine that wider, larger scale political crises may be dominating the EU political landscape. And indeed, we would hope that preparations are already underway to deal with what may come about during an Orban presidency of the EU at a time when the situation regarding Ukraine will be extremely delicate. So if there's a year to have this wrapped up, what will be accepted in that time will depend on politics. It will depend on political deals on the partial reform that may pass. It won't depend on legal matters. It won't depend on the legal value of the proposals on the table, the legal design or the legal necessity. It won't depend on the quality in terms of law, the workability in law of these proposals. It will depend on political deals, and indeed political deals that are quite distant from the asylum and migration field. So for instance, one of the key questions I would argue is whether the post-COVID funds are enough to convince Italy to accept changes in asylum law that are not in their interest. That is not a matter that has anything to do with asylum law, but that is a crucial factor in determining what happens in the next year. From a protection perspective, all of the reforms reduce protection standards. They aim to contribute or reduce the contribution of Europe to the global protection system. They focus on limiting arrivals of people in Europe with a secondary focus on limiting so-called secondary movement of people. And this comes from political objectives. Either forces don't want Europe to offer protection at all, but also, let's say, on the more progressive and technocratic and pragmatic side, the idea that in order to save protection in Europe, it's necessary to limit the numbers of people who receive protection, but also, and above all, to limit the number of people who arrive crossing a border without papers, and that limiting that movement, which is the basic fundamental movement of refugees, that let's say, well-intentioned but misguided political to save protection in Europe. With all of that said, I'm trying to state this factually. It may be that this raft of proposals reduces protection standards, but there is also a need to end this process of reform. To the other side of the coin, the under-enforcement of law. And to end this reform, let's say, we're in an exercise of damage limitation. From ECRE's perspective, that would mean the fewest number of legislative reforms pass, because we believe that they serve misguided or malign political objectives. At odds, for instance, with the European Parliament, which is still strongly committed to the idea of package approach, believing that if a few of the proposals pass, it's better that all go through. I think that's a question for discussion. We would argue then that the proposals that don't pass must be withdrawn, and that the attention and resources then turn to the questions of implementation, compliance, and enforcement. If we're talking about damage limitation, it's also a question of trying to combat the most damaging of the proposals within this package. And from our perspective, that is all that is linked to instrumentalisation. And this is like a sub-package within the wider proposals, packages. And the idea of those proposals from 2021 is based on the idea of allowing derogation from EU asylum law. So essentially allowing member states to avoid the law, to derogate from the law, at will, and to select from a menu of derogations. So in that sense, it's moving away from the idea of a common system, because member states will be implementing different legal regimes, because they'll be able to select from this range of derogations. And the other risk which takes us to the global protection system is the codification of the concept of instrumentalization. Instrumentalization, in our view, is something, unfortunately, that has happened throughout history. People have manipulated refugees. It has always happened, it still happens. And the response to that should be to firm up protection standards. Instead, this idea of instrumentalization is a way to allow lowering of standards in a situation when another state is manipulating people in need of protection, people seeking protection. We would argue that this is an attempt at norm entrepreneurship. It's an effort to get this concept of instrumentalization into EU law, and then beyond that to bring it into international law. So with all of that said, those are some of the issues in relation to the legislative package. As from ECRA's perspective, we work extensively on the ongoing negotiations in those efforts to, for instance, introduce safeguards where they're needed, to try to ensure that what comes out of this process is the least bad of the various bad reform options, which is not necessarily idealistic or satisfying work, but we believe it's necessary in the sense that reforms are moving forward. If we look then at the element of under-enforcement, there are multiple implementation gaps when it comes to EU asylum law. I think those need to be addressed in parallel always to legislative reform. Otherwise, what hope is there that new legal frameworks will actually be implemented? In a situation where violations are tolerated, where impunity rules the day in certain circumstances, the future implementation of reformed law can be put into question. And here I would say that the PROTECT project also demonstrates very well some of those implementation gaps which can be addressed. So, for instance, the questions of reception, asylum decision-making, all the information on status determination that comes out of Work Package 3, I think, is interesting, but also the demonstration of the need to have specialised asylum authorities and the capacity, the resources, the investment in making asylum systems function. All of that is possible. It's possible now with the existing legal framework, and it will be not just possible but necessary whatever reforms are finally accepted. I think it was interesting to hear the Commission's view that it is engaging more and more in implementation. Whether that should be the Commission's role, I think, is a question. But what clearly is the Commission's role is to ensure that the Member States implement and that the Member States comply with the legal framework, whatever it is. And this is something we would hope for a stronger focus on if there is a final exit from this hyper-production of legislation and a move towards reaffirming the need for enforcement. One of the other elements from the PROTECT project that I thought was interesting in this regard is the analysis of the history of asylum within Europe and this switch to the dominance of ministries of the interior. I think this helps us explain why the particular political objectives in question are leading to particular choices about legislation. In a sense, it's almost inevitable that ministers and policymakers whose prime concern, as they see it, is reinforcing borders, dealing with security defined in a very narrow way, that they would then put forward proposals that go in this particular direction. And I think at the EU level, some of these institutional dynamics and institutional changes are perhaps understudied. So you could also see the split between Justice and Home Affairs and Justice now. Interior Ministry, the role of DG Home Affairs, and the separate and marginalised position of DG Justice. Previously, those issues were together, were integrated. It meant that in asylum and wider migration policy making, the justice element, which is that which refers also to the human rights of people concerned, was more central. So I think that is also an issue to consider. I'm not sure that any of that can change, but those also internal questions of where do resources go within institutions. So the importance of having that at national level, which is demonstrated in the PROTECT.project, also made me think about issues such as distribution within DG Home of resources, where you have 25 people working on return and illegal migration, and 2.5 people working on enforcement of EU asylum law within an overloaded asylum unit, which is having to pump out legislation as well as trying to follow compliance. As a final note on this question of enforcement and reform, I also wanted to note one of the work packages which we've also found particularly interesting is work package 4 on the vulnerability question. This risk that the reforms are putting forward something that allows rights only to vulnerable groups, I think is a constant concern. And in the note on that work package, there was a phrase that struck me, that this is about selective rather than additional assistance. And this is something to be, that certainly for us, we need to be aware of, where there's an inadvertent risk of reinforcing that approach. Other elements that I think can be underlined is the importance of procedural guarantees, which again come across in the PROTECT project as sometimes overlooked elements of the asylum system. The only way that there can be a genuine balance between the individuals, often vulnerable but not necessarily vulnerable, in the face of the powerful state, is if the procedural guarantees are respected. And the legislative reforms are based very often on removing or at least reducing procedural guarantees, because this is considered as something that isn't as much of a risk as changing substantive law, even though that is also happening. Finally, on this point of enforcement, we would also note that the lack of respect for law in this area cannot be contained. I think there's sometimes a thought that it doesn't really matter if EU asylum law is not respected. That will have no impact on other areas of EU law. But at a time of a widening and deepening rule of law crisis, and I think that's absolutely not the case. There is quite strong possibility of a spillover into other areas of law, other areas of EU law I'm talking about here, not wider international law, if this is tolerated. The global compacts have a role to play, as PROTECT has also shown. I think the handbook developed in Work Package 2, which looks at the Global Compact on Refugees and the Common European Asylum System, is very useful. It shows the GCR is not there. It's deliberately not designed to create new norms. It has most value, I would argue, as an operational tool. And it's useful in the SEAS context as helping in both the design and the interpretation of EU asylum law, with a certain role but a lesser role in implementation. In terms of the GCM, we could argue that normatively there are developments there. It's in the form of soft law, not hard law, but there are implications for the human rights of people on the move. And if the assertion of the project that asylum is somehow lost in migration is correct. And if this tendency continues, then the question of the human rights of all people on the move and the human rights of all in migration becomes ever more important. Moving on to my second point in this law versus politics question. I think we also see over the last 3 years that politics is undermining Europe's effort to create a rules-based international order, or to defend a rules-based international order, we might say. And that, of course, is and has been at the heart of what is EU external action. It remains on paper, at least, an element of the foreign policy of many of the EU's member states as well. The global protection system depends on international law. It depends on, it needs a norms-based international system. And that in general is threatened. But there are particular challenges when it comes to this question of asylum and in particular migration. So EU external action and national European external policies over the last 3 years have continued efforts which have been going on for 20 years already to use external policies to meet particular political objectives. In doing so, there are a number of different ways in which international law is undermined. Now, it wouldn't be the simple integration of displacement and protection as an issue into external policies that would create damage. Clearly not. I mean, that could and should have a positive impact. Rather, it's the effort to meet a particular political objective through the use of external policies. And that is the objective, again, of preventing migration towards Europe, including prevention of the movement of those who need protection. We see multiple efforts to use policy funding pressure going back again over 20 years with a lot of interesting research in these areas, from the use of agreements to integrate return, pressure on third countries in multiple ways. In the last 3 years, certain developments could be noted beyond the usual rhetoric and pushes in these directions. One is the start of the implementation of the obligation to earmark 10% of EU external funding for migration widely writ. A second one is the expanded presence of internal actors of the EU outside of Europe. And that is in regard to the actions of the Commissioner for Justice and Home Affairs Commissioner Johansson, who spends quite a large amount of time engaging with governments, policymakers outside of Europe, because obviously there's nothing to do within Europe. But it's also in the use of the EU's agencies outside Europe, and particularly the expansion of Frontex in this regard. The impact of all of that remains to be seen. From our perspective, we're monitoring what impact Frontex is having, for instance, in West Africa, as well as Frontex's actions longer established in the Sahel. What we've seen recently is also an attempt to go beyond the traditional efforts to use development policy to try to meet these particular objectives of controlling and preventing migration. We see increased attempts to use security policy. So the integration into the mandates of the common security and defence policy missions of the EU of migration control objectives is one element. But we also see a new, or perhaps a renewed focus on trade policy. And here I would mention the summit that took place last month of the heads of state and government of the EU, where A strong focus, again, was on what's happening externally. As we know, this derives in part from a lack of agreement on what should be done internally. Much of what was said was not new, but there were elements to keep an eye on, such as the expansion of Frontex outside the EU, but also this effort to use trade policy. Whether we see resistance from DG Trade, I think, is an interesting question on this. Many of these efforts undermine international law. So they encourage a move away from the objectives set out in the Lisbon Treaty that focus external policy on conflict prevention, human rights, democracy, rule of law, values and objectives that are rooted in the international legal framework. This Article 21 of the Lisbon Treaty is rather difficult to litigate on, and that's probably impossible. However, there are prospects when it comes to the Charter of Fundamental Rights. As it stands, we see what is an increasing disregard for those bases in international law of external policy. But we should also look at the impact on the situation within third countries, where some of these efforts encourage a lowering of standards in those countries. And I would say it's generally true that the more undemocratic the country, the better a partner it is when it comes to external migration cooperation. The shift that has happened within the EU towards the dominance of ministries of the interior is also replicated in those countries which become partners in some of these efforts, because the focus and the partners are at national level in those countries tend to be interior ministries, agencies of law enforcement, agencies of border control, which often themselves are among the more repressive and more least respectful of human rights of the agencies within those countries concerned. The compacts, in theory, should offer us something here, but I think more likely to resist these trends are always the actions and agency of the countries and the people, the populations that are targets of these kind of efforts. Let me move to my third and final point in this reflection on law and politics and Europe's role in the global protection system over the last 3 years. The incontournable, the impossible to avoid, the response to displacement from Ukraine. This demonstrates both a different response to a major displacement crisis, but also a different kind of relationship between law and politics in this area of protection. So, notwithstanding the immense humanitarian challenges that continue to play out, we would say that the political response to this crisis has been exemplary. It has been a great success. It's a positive response. And the response is the opposite of the usual response to a major displacement crisis. So if we see what's happened, access allowed at the borders instead of the usual response, where all efforts are made to deny access, from the use of force, violence, and so on, to changes to the law that would seek to deny access. Rapid access to protection status, indeed automatic access to a protection status, thanks to the activation of the TPD. Again, the usual response, every possible effort to limit to make it more difficult to access a protection status with small and limited exceptions. Freedom of movement is not just allowed, it's encouraged and facilitated and paid for this group of people seeking protection. The usual, as we know, every effort to restrict freedom of movement and the belief that allowing freedom of movement is something that will will create such damage that it must be combated in every possible way. Family reunification has been allowed and facilitated, I think, primarily because of allowing freedom of movement. In general, of course, there is a major problem with implementation of the right to family reunification, be that the implementation of the elements of the Dublin regulation or the separate directive or the international legal standards on this issue. In this case, it's working. And what we also see demonstrated is that freedom of movement and family reunification can be beneficial not just to the individuals, but also to states. So it changes perception. And then above all, the decision to manage this crisis instead of the usual panic and paralysis, all of that has meant a different relationship between law and politics. We've seen the use of a legal tool, the political decision to activate, put in place and work with a tool that exists in the legal framework. And the focus was on securing the political decision to activate this legal mechanism, rather than efforts to circumvent the law, to change the law, to put in place emergency measures and then launch a whole set of proposals that would reform the law in a negative direction. The reasons why things were different in this case have also been widely discussed. It is, of course, to do with race, religion, and I think in particular the intersection between age and sex and race and religion, and the different profile of people arriving. It's also to do with geography, proximity, the contiguous nature of Ukraine as a crisis. But it was also due to the awareness that any kind of panic would have major security and indeed military implications by playing directly into the hands of Putin. So the choices made were different. And that brings me to my conclusions, and I'll end there. Happy to hear your views on some of these points. In this whole issue of asylum, global protection system, Europe's role within the global protection system and the global protection system within Europe, there are multiple major conflicts. And some of those conflicts are at times manifested in violence. Other times they remain deep and bitter political conflicts. I think one of the problems of recent years has been the attempt to resolve those political conflicts through legal reform, which makes bad law and doesn't actually go anywhere towards resolving the political conflicts. There is also a conflict which is perhaps a perennial one, which is the conflict between politics and law itself, and who will win in that case. It might seem that politics, or a particular negative brand of politics, is winning, but I don't think that's actually the case. There are significant constraints on political action that are imposed by law, and the attention and the effort to change law, I think, just demonstrates the constraining fact that law, constraining influence that law still has. And that may be derived from the judiciary playing its role and the need, for instance, on the part of civil society or others. We rely on the judiciary to defend protection, the right to asylum, the human rights of people on the move in such a hostile political environment, because litigation is arguably more effective than advocacy and influencing, although both are needed. So there's the judiciary acting in this way, but there is also all the efforts to ensure that the legal framework within Europe continues to largely embody and integrate international legal obligations that are derived from international law. So the amount of effort that is focused on the legal framework also derives from that. Because if the legal framework changes, then that first element of being able to rely on the judiciary is also lost, because the legal framework that they will be interpreting and applying will be one that has lesser protection standards. Are there lessons to be learned from Ukraine displacement in all of this? Will it make a difference? I think absolutely yes. It is a major difference, and the point is that that different approach needs to be applied to the protection system as a whole. In the short term, the importance is also about integrating lessons from the Ukraine displacement crisis into the proposed legislative reforms, which on paper go in a completely opposite direction. So there are already changes in this regard. So, for instance, the legislative reforms proposed repeal of the TPD, to repeal a legal tool that is currently hosting nearly 5 million people, creates a legal regime that creates 5 million people, would be risky at best. In our view, the alternatives being proposed are not adequate and not a good replacement for the TPD. I'm happy to discuss that more if that's of interest. In addition, I think the use of certain measures that put in place a completely different model are being reconsidered. So, for instance, I think most notably, the border procedure and the concentration of efforts in this model of people being contained at borders in substandard procedures is harder to sell and harder to agree when the Ukraine response goes in the other direction. So what is ultimately agreed, I think, will show some influences from the Ukraine experience. On the solidarity question, here I think there is more potential in what happens in practice than what may happen in legal changes. So the Ukraine response has given rise to the Solidarity Platform and efforts to put in place practical alternatives on solidarity. This may be potentially more valuable than the endless, stale and irresolvable debate among the member states on solidarity. There is nonetheless a resolute effort to say that there is nothing to learn from Ukraine and to push ahead with the reforms that go in the opposite direction. The argument that's made is that this is separate. That is a particular displacement crisis that has no relevance to the other displacement crises, the other groups of people arriving to seek protection in Europe. That those are questions, for instance, of structural migration. Even though it's the case that the majority of those arriving in Europe have protection needs. So I think this is hanging in the balance now, and it is something on which united efforts need to be put in place to try to bring out and the learning and the use of tools from the Ukraine response instead. And a final note on that, I think it's also interesting to hear that in some cases there are efforts to preempt legislative change by putting in place measures that haven't yet been agreed by the co-legislators. So some of the comments from the Commission refer, for instance, to the pilot projects on the use of the border procedure. This is something that is at the heart of ongoing negotiations. So introducing pilot proposals to put in place something that hasn't yet been agreed, I think sounds rather undemocratic in its efforts to bypass the legislative procedures. This may take us back to similarities with what's happened in Greece, where, of course, we see efforts to pilot and continue to consolidate and keep in place measures that are not in line with the legal framework. So will law or politics win in all of this? Perhaps neither. There are practical and pragmatic changes and efforts taking place. It is also the case that whatever the law is, member states will make a lot of effort to avoid it. New law may well be rather unenforceable and unworkable. A key question will be whether the Commission shows more inclination to insist on compliance with the law. So some other political decisions are relevant. Who will be the next commissioner and commissioners working in this area? What will be the decision on the part of the Commission about its role? Is it there to do what the member states want or to defend the treaties? The idea of peer-to-peer enforcement, I think, is also extremely interesting and one that opens up potential for more development. In this whole context, people will still continue to arrive in need of protection because that's the global context within which Europe is operating. Smugglers will continue to ignore the law completely because criminal law is so poorly enforced that it makes asylum law look effective. NGOs may increasingly be forced to operate outside the law. When I see most of our members, many organisations are willing to do that. And I think that comes from the trend towards criminalisation of activities that many in the civil society sector believe should not be outlawed. Indeed, they're often activities where we feel we're stepping in because states are not meeting their obligations, be that search and rescue or provision of humanitarian assistance to people in destitution as a result of punitive policies. So politics will continue to attempt to change law and to manipulate it. But we could also hope that the political decision to manage, to focus on making asylum systems function, will also be part of the ongoing discussion. And I think underlying this also is an issue about political decisions about how to relate to the public, and to also try to shape and influence public opinion rather than misrepresenting it and using it to justify particularly harsh policies. But I think also to respond to broader public opinion rather than concentrating on certain segments where the approach may be more limited. So I'm going to stop there because I'm tailing off into new areas and happy to hear your comments and views.